the recording here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started talking about strategies for writing papers. So I think what we'll do is we'll hear first from each of our faculty panelists kind of in turn, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions and discuss and kind of share our own experiences and thoughts and ask them questions at the end. So while they're talking, feel free to comment and make questions in the chat, and we will come back around to those in the latter part of the call. Hi, Dr. Bertrand-Jones.
Hi, how are y'all?
Doing good. How are you doing?
Good, good, good.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I was just kind of introducing the topic. So I think if it's okay with you guys, I might turn it over to Dr. Zuilkowski first, and then Dr. Park, and then Dr. Bertrand-Jones, and then at the end we'll have questions and discussion. Does that sound good? Okay. All right.
Okay. Kate, can you allow me to share my screen? It says it's
yes. Let's see. Participants. Okay. Just allowing you now.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Kate had asked me, I had sent a few guiding questions for us to think about as we organized our thoughts around writing. So I'd picked on a few of those and had some ideas and some things that I think are useful to me and to people I work with. So this isn't really so much a kind of an organized beginning to end how to write presentation, because I only have 10 minutes. It's more of a series of tips. And then I also want to show you how I use outlines in my own writing. So one useful thing to think about is I often find that doctoral students and people new to academic writing get really intimidated about how to start or how to do this, or, could I really write a journal article? And so I think it's helpful to remember that most journal articles in our field are pretty basic. They have the same structure. So you have an introduction, a background and context section, method section, findings, and discussion. And that's it. So, this isn't creative writing we're doing. You don't need to be inspired, and, there's a structure here, and that structure can provide you with what you need to get started. So I always start with, here's my 5 sections, and go from there. And I'll show you in the next step how I go from there. And you want to make sure that your paper is really clearly focused on one or more specific research questions. So one of the questions Kate had asked was, why is a paper good, or what makes a paper good to you? And for me, it's when there's a really clear motivation for it. It's not just like, well, we had some data and here's a paper with a bunch of random results. It has to be answering a question, and a question that's important. So I like to see that motivation really clearly laid out in the beginning of the paper. It needs to be clear from the first couple of paragraphs what the data is going to be speaking about and what the authors are writing about. So always starting with the research question and not with the data, I think makes a good paper. So my biggest, most important tip is to write from a detailed outline. And, a lot of people, particularly people who are kind of naturally good writers, which probably includes a lot of us, probably used to be able to just sit down and wing it. Like when you were in high school or maybe in college, you could just kind of sit and write. But, the further along you get, the harder it is to do that well. And now, since I read a lot of other people's work, I can tell really clearly when someone has planned out their argument and when they just sat down and started writing. And in a journal article, which is so limited with the amount of space that you have, you really need to make sure that every paragraph and every sentence is working for you and moving your argument forward. So when I'm outlining something, I start with my 5 sections, and then I write topic sentences. And that helps you make sure that you're not wasting space or going off into the weeds. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute. And then under that, you can add all of your citations and your subpoints that develop that argument. And so then by the time you actually start writing, your outline has all of the detail in it. And then it becomes just a matter of making full sentences and connecting paragraphs and that kind of thing. And it really makes it less intimidating, I think, than just sitting down and staring at a big blank screen. So make sure that your argument remains logical because you looked at it before you made it really long, when it was a simple short version. And it makes it a lot easier to write in smaller chunks, which is really important for all of us because we're all super busy. You're never going to have a free week to write something. You're going to have to get used to writing in smaller pieces. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I want to show you really quickly one of my outlines. So I actually don't have a lot of them to show because I write in them. So, I do the outline and then I just start writing in that same document. So this is one where it was a special edition of a journal. So I had an abstract written, but then nothing else. So then my next step was to put into my 5 sections. You see them right here: introduction, background and context, etc. And then I have topic sentences. So I knew I wanted to start here in the background section with the idea that most international donor aid to higher ed goes to scholarships rather than capacity development. And I put my citation in right there. So similarly throughout here, I've got some subpoints with some examples. Everything is cited and I've got it all in EndNote right here. So I don't have to come back around and do that later. It just saves a ton of time. There's some important frameworks that I wanted to put in. I put them right in here with quotation marks, etc. So got all my subsections. My argument is organized. I've got a however here because this next section is points that are contrary to the ones that came before, local context, text section, etc. So that's one example, and I'll show you one more. So this is a paper using data from a UNICEF project in northern Nigeria. So similarly, I knew the main points I wanted to make. I knew how I needed to get in the introduction from the broad global importance of the topic down to my specific topic. And you can see I've got my research questions here right in the introduction to remind me that those need to be really clear. And then as you go down, you can see this one's a little less developed than the previous one I showed you, but I've got it all laid out. So I know that I'm looking at conflict and violence outside of schools as well as inside of schools. So I need to talk about those separately with separate references. I've got my context section, and I've got a ton of citations in here that I know I need to use, and they're all easily already placed in here. So when it comes time to write, I just go right to full sentences, and it's all organized. That's how I typically approach working from an outline. Go back to the slides for a moment. So another one of the points that Kate asked me to think about was how to write a discussion section of an article, because I know that's something that often is tricky. And again, I try to remind myself that there's nothing magical about this. There's really 3 things that you have to do in a discussion section. You have to summarize your findings in layman's terms, and it's particularly important if you've done something quantitative. You need to be able to write the discussion section so that a government policymaker or someone at a foundation or anywhere else who isn't a statistician can read it and understand what you did. The second thing you need to do is connect your findings back to the literature that you cited in your introduction and background section. And then third, talk about the implications for policy practice and future research, whatever mix of those is right, depending on your topic. So in general, I find that those are the 3 chunks that are always present in my discussion. And then depending on the topic, there may be some additional topics. But again, it's a place to start and to feel less like you've got the blank page. If you know these 3 things have to be done, you put them in your outline and then take them piece by piece. All right, so some general comments. I really encourage students to find collaborators with complementary skills with similar goals. So people who are similarly motivated to publish, but maybe one of you is really great at the quantitative methods and another one of you is really great writer, for example, so that you have a team that is going to produce a really strong paper. And I also encourage you to when you find good collaborators, treat them like gold. They're so important. I don't always make every deadline in my life, but I have a few people that I write with that I do. Like I would never, ever miss a deadline because I've committed to them that we're going to write this paper together and I'm going to meet the deadlines. And that's the relationship that we have. So I really encourage you to try to find those people that you can write with, because it makes it a lot easier to stay on track when you have that kind of accountability. Start thinking about publications early on, thinking about papers you've written for classes and whether you can turn that into a publishable literature review or some other form of publication. Identify your outlets really early in the process. So which journal you're going to send it to really makes a difference in terms of how you structure it, because some journals might break things down a little differently, or they're going to use a different format, APA versus MLA or whatever other format. Your abstract could be 100 words, it could be 200 words. It's easier just to know all of that ahead of time and to write it that way. Get comfortable writing in small chunks. So there's just no way that you're going to be able to sit down, regularly and write for a whole day. And that's probably not very effective for most people anyway. That said, if you're looking at a blank page and a blinking cursor, it's really hard to get going. So that's why I really like my small bullets approach, because even if I only have half an hour, if I can write out one bullet and turn one bullet into a short paragraph, then that's a win for the day. I've moved forward. So that's something I really, really recommend. I recommend that you form writing groups for accountability. So even if you're not formally writing together, having a group where you can meet, twice a month perhaps, and just check in, say what you're working on, get feedback and support is a really useful thing to do. Keep a tracking spreadsheet and put all of your ideas in it. So I'm always thinking like, oh, that would make a great paper. I have no time to write it now. I'm going to put it in my list. And then when I have space again, I go back to my list and think like, all right, what do I prioritize next? So a spreadsheet, not only of what you have going, what might be out for review, but also future ideas. And then finally, I'd say it's really important to read the journals that you want to publish in, because journals have very different types of things that they like to publish. So if you have a good understanding from reading what a particular journal looks like, then you can do a better job of writing for that style and for that particular kind of audience. Okay, so I think with that, I will stop and hand it over to one of my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Z. That was great. Dr. Park, do you want to go next?
Sure, I would love to.
Okay.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but I hope I have some helpful things to say.
I'm sure you will.
I agree with everything Stephanie shared with you. I think I'll add some nuance there. And I think the one thing you'll probably pick up on across all three of us is that you have to do what works for you, right? So I did not have the gift of writing. It was harder for me. My undergraduate degree is in math. My master's degree is in higher education management, which will have a little bit of writing, but nowhere near what I had to do in graduate school. So it was harder for me. I found the way I was able to be successful in the tried and true method was to be somewhat, and I'll say this out loud, knowing maybe it's not a smart thing to say, but being somewhat formulaic and being very explicit. So for instance, one thing that was drilled into me in graduate school, which I still do to this day, is at the end of the first paragraph, or maybe the second, you have a sentence that starts, "The purpose of this paper is to," and you explicitly state that. Because I cannot tell you how frustrating it is as a professor and reading other people's work if you have to guess what the purpose of the study is. And if you get to page 4 and you still don't know, I'm not going to read it. Of course, I'm grading it, I will, right? But like as a general study, if I get to page 4 and I don't know what the hell this thing is about, that's not going to work. The other tactic that I've taken is the idea of also in delivery of speeches. Tell people what you're going to tell them what you have to tell them, and then remind them what you just told them. That's how I teach. That's how I write papers as well, right? You foreshadow the purpose of this manuscript is to X, Y, and Z. Then you do X, Y, and Z. And as Dr. Zuilkowski said before in the discussion, you say, as I just mentioned, here's X, Y, Z again, in a very straightforward kind of plain language way. I think somewhat important to this is this idea of storytelling. If you didn't get a chance to attend or live yesterday or watch yet, Alonzo Gilzine, our newest faculty member, gave a great presentation yesterday about the art of storytelling. And I forget who made this comment, but someone had mentioned that it's maybe we're inclined to think that qualitative research is all about storytelling, but so is quantitative research, and so is any research for that matter, because you're interpreting this and you're telling a story. Here's the way I write. I read things out loud to myself, almost like it's a sermon or a story time. That's what I do at the very end, right? Like when I think I'm pretty much set, I did this in grad school too. I would read my papers out loud. It's easier to spot things that are awkward, that don't make sense, and areas for further development. So this is a later on in the process type thing. I still do it before I submit to a journal, still to this day. My cats are some of the most educated cats in the country, right? They've listened there about developmental education and community colleges. They are experts on compared to the New York Times series. They could probably do state of themselves because they've heard all these papers before. I think the other thing, and Stephanie mentioned this as well, is to read broadly in the journals that you want to publish in, but just in general. It helped me so much with just the style of writing. And I taught lit review. I know Tamara usually teaches this class, but I had a chance to teach it last fall. And she had put the course together in a great way. And the only additions I made really were, there's several different websites, and we can link them online if you'd like, of that teach you how the phrasing can work. So for instance, let's go back to the limitation, or I'm sorry, the discussion section. The way I still write these things is I found X, which is similar to what Y found, or I found X, which questions what Y found. And then in the implication section, because I found X, I suggest Y. Like, just to have that sort of cadence helps me immensely to kind of stay on track. I think the other thing too is you have to make an appointment with yourself to do this. One thing COVID has done for me is I used to keep a physical notebook or a physical calendar, and I don't anymore. I have it all on the computer now because there's just too much to keep track of and whatnot. But I do set aside appointments where I try to just have time where I'm going to work on this, and that's just what I'm going to do. I think the working in groups and having writing accountability groups is a great thing. For working on projects, I meet weekly, and if nothing else, it's an accountability for us, me, them, and everybody. I also really like this idea of keeping spreadsheets of submission. So one additional data point that I track is the timeline. So I submit to a journal, I write the date down. When I hear back the first thing, which is hopefully revise and resubmit, I put that date down. I put down the date that I sent it back. I put down the date that I hear a final decision, and so forth. Part of that is, as you get further along in this, you realize, okay, this journal takes a real long time. So, like it's just helpful. And the other thing too is, and this is some on the other side, I have a late review right now. I do. And I got to get it done by the end of the day tomorrow. It's 3 weeks late. It's for research in higher education. It's for my former major professor, and I got to get this thing done, right? So you just got to stick with keeping that as a priority. In terms of ideas, second mention the spreadsheet, here's what I do. I find myself often get the best ideas when I'm listening to like a Florida Department of Education speech, or I'm at a webinar, or I'm at a conference or something. I text myself. And I also have a Google Doc where I put this, but if I'm just in the room listening, if I text myself, it's just a way that I found over the years to keep track of different ideas. And the other thing too, and this is somewhat related, but also don't be afraid to go to the people who presented this, especially if they're, I pride myself and I really enjoy working with state agencies. I just think, I think there's a lot of influence there. I think it's important, it's interesting to me. Florida starting this, what they're calling flexible placement or multiple measures, I emailed the person who's doing a lot of work in this space to say, hey, can we talk more about this? Can we learn more about it? And the last thing I'll say with writing is, I think outlines are also incredibly important. I tend to navigate towards, for me, easier sections, which are the methods and the findings, right? But I found that can work, but it's nowhere near as effective. And I've had much greater success when I invest more heartily in the front end. So one of the questions that Kate had sent us, just to kind of generally feel, is about literature review. And when do you feel like you've read enough? Well, you're never going to feel that way, honestly. So I think it's okay to kind of set that aside. But also just understand, does the story make sense? And to understand as well that at some level, especially when submitting to journals, you have to give up. And I say this knowing that it took me years to do this, that perfectionist, I'm not going to let anybody see it until it's perfect piece. Because if you don't submit it, there's a 100% chance it's not going to get accepted. If you put it out there, it still may not, but you'll likely get some feedback. And I'm not saying just throw things out there and that they stick, they stick. But if you don't put it out there, it's definitely not going to get in, right? So I think just being okay with all right, I feel like I have a pretty good feedback here, or a pretty good narrative here. And then when you get feedback, understand that the person giving you that is also a person, right? So they're going to have their own biases and their own exposures and whatnot. And if it's in their area and you didn't cite them, and obviously you're not going to know this because you're not going to know who they are, of course they're going to come back and say, oh, you got to include this person and whatnot. And then kind of, my last piece is, how do I write now as opposed to as a student? I write much more collaboratively now, and I greatly value that. I guess I became a professor and thought, I got to do this all myself. I got to do this all myself. And different collaborators, one of which is Dr. Bertrand-Jones, I've learned that, you work very well together. And even when putting together the IES proposal that Christine and I did last summer, I found myself in the situation of trying to do it all myself and her having to tell me, well, I'm in this with you. We are partners in this. So tell me what you need me to do. And, that sort of thing's fine. So I think that's kind of my high level. I'm perfectly happy to answer additional questions, but that's kind of my high level thoughts on writing. And I guess I'll turn things over to Tamara.
I don't know, Kate, how y'all put together such, I think, a complimentary panel, but I think today we are all going to complement each other and focus on slightly different things. So I'm excited to be here to share some things with you all. I do have some slides, but that's because these things are part of the structure. And I think for me, I have found that I need to be more structured in helping to, one, make writing a habit, and I'm still working on. Some days I'm really good at the habit and other days I'm not so good at the habit. So I'll share with you some things that I use, or some strategies that I use to help make writing a habit for me. And let's see if I can show you my screen now. I'm gonna try to stay within my 10 minutes too, so y'all keep me on task.
You take whatever time you need. Dr. Park didn't take all his time, so he gifted some of it to you.
So I think about writing, or writing in general, and I think of these for me are like these 4 different buckets, or things that contribute to good writing. And to me, it's that awareness of who you are, and who are you, why are you engaging in this writing process? What are you hoping to get out of it? There's some habits about writing. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about those, but there are things that we've unconsciously and consciously do when we're actually engaging in writing that I think can be good as well as detrimental to our writing. Some specific tools like Dr. Park and I think both Dr. Zuilkowski were giving you, I think, are tools to help with organizing your writing and ways to make sure that you are articulating your argument. So today I'm going to share just the personal strategies that are kind of, again, part of that self-awareness piece and knowing who you are. One of my favorite resources is the Academic Phrase Bank. And this was, I can't remember, actually I do. One of my mentors actually shared it with me and I love it. I love templates. I love things that help me with my structure, help with language. The Academic Phrase Bank, I call it my Academese translator. So when you're looking for words that sound more academic, you know what you want to say, you know what you're trying to do. The Academic Phrase Bank is perfect in helping to identify specific words, phrases, if you will, that will help with any part of writing, introducing ideas, concluding ideas. Like Dr. Park mentioned, some of those, I call them templates, the templates of language that you can use that you can incorporate in every paper. And so Academic Phrase Bank is a great source of coming up with some new ways of saying what you already say throughout all of your papers. So some of my personal strategies are figuring out what you have to do. So writing is a task, but there are multiple mini tasks within writing that have to be accomplished to get this paper written, or whatever task you're trying to accomplish as it relates to where you're writing a chapter or an outline, whatever. And for me, one of the things that I would do is I would underestimate the amount of time it would take for me to do something. And I realized that I was writing the task wrong on my to-do list. So I would write down, write literature review. Yeah, today, Monday, I'm gonna write my literature review. No, that's not happening, especially if it's a new paper, it's a new project. You can't write, well, you could write a literature review in a day, but I wasn't writing literature review in a day. I had a chunk of time. I didn't have a whole day to write a literature review. So identifying the tasks that you need to accomplish is more than just, okay, I got to write a literature review today, but breaking them down into the most minute detail of the task. And I put here, it's a screenshot from an Excel file that I have, and I'll share a link to a OneDrive folder with these resources in it. And so you can kind of see here, organizing myself by project along with individual tasks or things that needed to get done for those projects. So writing literature review wasn't on my task list. It was searching for articles for the lit review. It was reading articles, and even reading articles 1 through 3, because you're not going to read them all in a night unless you're cramming and you staying up all night to try to get this done. And so how can you make sure that you are identifying the specific tasks that you need to accomplish, and then putting those things on your calendar, not just leaving them to chance to be able to do. And I had gotten really good at this, and I've gotten slightly off it now, but so you have an idea of how much time it's going to take you to do these things, and you're allocating the appropriate time for them. You're putting that task on your calendar, not just okay, here's the 5 things that I need to do today. But for me, I needed to see where or when I was going to try to get those 5 things done. And of course, being flexible. You know, there were things come up, unexpected meetings, unscheduled meetings come up, or just life happens. And so how can you make sure that, you know, you leave a little buffer for life to happen? Something else that's been helpful for me is schedule a set time for writing and specific tasks. So whether it is once a week, it's every Friday from 10 to 12. Now in my schedule, it's Thursdays from 10 to 12. So I know that on Thursday, I try my absolute best not to schedule anything on Thursdays from 10 to 12, because I know that that's at least this one set dedicated time that I'm sitting to write on whatever project I'm working on in that day. I suggest definitely having more time. So if you could set aside, you know, the 15 minutes a day, I used to do that, and I was really productive in doing that. And so I might need to try that again. But setting aside a time, whether it be every day, every 3 days, something consistent that you know that, all right, I'm going to commit to doing this writing that I need to get done. My other favorite thing is setting a timer. I have so many alarms on my phone to remind me where I need to be, but setting the timer helps me. It also helps to quell some of my procrastination tendencies. So if it's something I really don't want to do, or if I'm stuck in writing something, I'm like, I just don't feel like doing this. So I'll set a timer. All you got to do is sit here for 15 minutes, sit here for 5 minutes, sit here for whatever block of time you give yourself, and just do it. Just set the timer, just do it. And once the timer goes off, you're done for the day or for that whatever block of time. One of the other things that I found that's helpful is the Pomodoro method. Y'all know Pomodoro method? I love Pomodoro because that, again, has helped with me in my procrastination. I'm like, okay, I can sit here for 15 minutes. Come on, Tamara. You can exercise some self-discipline in this moment to try to get this done. The other thing that I would suggest is definitely tracking of your writing. So Dr. Zuilkowski talked about tracking your ideas, and I love that, in trying to create some one place where all of your ideas reside. I need to figure that out, because I just keep them in my notebook, my annual notebooks, but I've had ideas from 5 years ago that have come back to me, and now I got to comb through all of my notebooks. Similar to that, keeping track of your writing sessions helps you to know that you're actually writing. It's kind of like a food log. You know, you're like, oh no, I'm not eating sugar. I've been abstaining from sugar. And then you look back, if you're tracking your food, you look back, you're like, oh, I had sugar every day. The kind of like, this helps you not to be more honest with yourself. You say, oh, I'm writing. Yes, I'm writing consistently. I am absolutely writing consistently. Actually, no, you're not, because you're not tracking of the sessions. Something else that is connected to this is including dates in your file names. So every time you work on a document, add today's date at the end of it. It also helps you to see how consistently you've been writing on this particular task. But it also helps you, in case you in an earlier draft, you want to go back to an idea that you had. And if you just keep using the same file name, you've written over your ideas. So if you, unless you've printed the document or you've named it something different, you can't get your old ideas back. So this helps me to kind of stay on track, as well as to be more honest with myself about how often I'm engaging or writing. So after you got to track your sessions, you just write. And so putting your butt in the seat to force yourself to write, or I should say force yourself to write, thinking about how, reframing how we think about writing, and not as a task to do or as something that we are begrudgingly doing, but think about it as it's part of our identity, it's part of what we do as scholars. And I think that as you begin to write more, it also connects with your identity. And so you start to see yourself more as a scholar. And the more you see yourself as a scholar, then you do scholarly things, and you don't create this mental block in your mind about, oh, I'm not a writer, or oh, I'm not a researcher, or oh, I'm not these things, but actually I've been doing these things. So maybe I am a writer. Okay, so writers write. Let me sit down and write. Sometimes you're stuck though. You don't know what to write. And you don't have a fantastic topic sentence. You're trying to write your topic sentence, as Dr. Zuilkowski suggested. So what can you do if you're not there yet? If you want you're still in that brainstorming phase. And my mentor, Danelle, gave us these free writing questions that I think are very helpful. You choose one, you set your timer, and you just go, just write. And what it does is it sparks that creativity again for you. It helps you to think about some of the things that may not be directly research related, but they still keep you in that mindset about your topic or your task or your project. I talked about the file names. And then the last one, y'all, is the revising and editing. Oftentimes this gets the shaft because we're up against our deadlines. And this, I would say that the revision and the editing process are so very important as a part of writing. So making sure that you incorporate time, if you got deadline that you need to adhere to, back that up a little bit so that you can have time to let it sit, just kind of like a cake or a steak. After a steak cooks, you're supposed to let it rest before you cut into it. And I think about papers. I think about my academic writing in the same way. How can I let it sit? Let me let it cool before I put the icing on the cake. And the revision and the editing process, I think for me is like that, putting the icing on the cake. And then expect challenge. There are days where you don't want to do this. This little person here is my inner 2-year-old, and they come alive all the time when I think about writing some days, or all of the things that you don't want to do. And so there are days that I give into this. There are days that I challenge her and say, no, I am the boss of you and you need to do this writing today. And then she may pout a little bit, but she gets started, especially when I set a timer. So figuring out how can you want to give yourself some grace, but at the same time, what do you do when you continuously run up against this challenge or to me, it's about self-management. So what strategies can you use for yourself so that you are creating the best environment so that you can go forth and communicate your ideas, so that you are able to contribute to the literature in ways that you want. So I'll stop there. I have this in some other resources. I'll put it in this OneDrive folder or SharePoint folder that you can access. There's a whole lot of articles that I've collected over the years from class, not from class, that colleagues have shared that are in that folder. So hopefully you'll be able to access it. If not, we'll figure out another way to get it to you. But for me, it's been the personal management, what sort of structures can I put in place to help ease the way for the writing.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for sharing all those resources. Now I just want to go create a lot of Excel spreadsheets.
Well, you don't have to. You don't
No,
have
I
to.
want to. Now, I just appreciate how each of you has brought really different angles to this topic, because there are so many different ways of thinking about it and different components to what's going on. You know, there's like the technical aspects of it, but there's also this kind of personal identity aspects of it. And there's just, yeah, I just appreciate the kind of diversity of perspectives that you all have shared. So I'm going to open it up now for anybody who wants to ask questions. I have a lot of questions, so I'm happy to start that. But if other people want to jump in and unmute themselves and ask questions, please do so, or you can put it in the chat.
I can start us off if we want. So I'm right now like in the middle of taking stuff from like Zotero and my Excel kind of synthesis sheet and putting it into a literature review. How do you, like, what processes do you all go through to this, right? So like I have the like citation manager, I have everything organized, and I have like information on like in an Excel sheet, but even still, like putting that into like an organized synthesis, that's a much bigger step that I haven't done before. So like any advice or maybe like protocols you go through to do that?
I kind of start with a blank Word document actually. And what are some of the major themes that I want to make sure that I'm covering in the lit review, or from each of the resources. So I typically start with one resource at a time. What are some of the major either findings? What are the points that I took away from that particular resource? And I'll drop them broad, sort of kind of like categories or subheaders, drop those in a Word document, and either drop in the particular quote from the article or the citation, just the author's name and year. So I know that, all right, this is the idea. They said this idea. And then I'll go to the other resource and do the same. And so you start to see, as you continue to work with multiple resources, all right, who's starting to say the same things? And then what did they say that you found particularly salient or important? And then you can start to use that to craft your narrative, or to actually craft the text that explains what that particular topic or that subject or that bucket might be. And then you can start to see also what buckets are bigger than the other buckets. So there might be a section where, 10 of your 15 references are talking about the same thing. And so you know that that's something that needs to have some prominence in the lit review. It also helps you to see some of the nuances or the subtopics within each of the larger buckets.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Amber.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Really, this has been so amazing. I mean, I didn't know what to write and what not to write. I was just quickly writing down everything, but I will look at the recording and, pick other things, because so many things that you shared, and I was like, oh God, I do that, and thank God I have this strategy to, sort of counter that. And especially, how to keep a check on my procrastination or something, how to remind myself where I've put, it's something that you put in a cupboard and you forget where it was, and you're sort of, thinking about it. So these Excel sheets, and I think this documentation can be, an answer to many of those problems. So I was just thinking, I don't know how, maybe it's that when you write an article, or when you write something, obviously everybody is going to sort of follow the same broad protocols, and they're all going to have a method section and a discussion and analysis and everything. as somebody who reads these articles, what is it that would stand out for you? I mean, obviously it could be a really amazing idea. It could be something that really strikes, for you, like on a personal level. But generally speaking, if you're reading an article, then what can be that one ingredient maybe that would stand out for somebody who's reading an article?
For me, honestly, it's like the explicit purpose statement. Like I'm not going to be if it's something that topically interests me, or obviously if it's a student paper, I'm going to read it. But if it's just something that I'm flipping through and I can't tell what it's about, I don't read it. I don't have the patience to have to figure out like, what is this about? So the extent to which you can very early on, I think the first paragraph, in my opinion, is very important, right? I think my style has been write a very broad, somewhat crazy first sentence, right? Like, the state of the community college, like far too many students enroll in developmental education and never attain an associate's degree or bachelor's degree, right? Recently, states have taken measures to improve upon this condition. And here is some different, the purpose of this study is to look at this specific state and what it did following. So I think that's what captures me. So I think investing in the front end is always really helpful. And then the other thing where I read is the abstract should have findings. So talk about like what the study is and then end it with, and I found blah, 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 blah. And do not end it with implications for research and practice are included, because obviously they are. So I think those sort of like, that's, if I'm being totally honest, that's when I pick up an article in ER, let's say, that's what I look for.
Oh, I agree. Go ahead, Stephanie. I'm just gonna reiterate what Tony said.
For me, it's consistency. One thing that really drives me nuts is when I see, a research question about one thing and then a literature review about something else, and then data that doesn't really speak to either of those things, and then like conclusions that are not supported by the data. And I see that a lot when I review, particularly because in international projects, it tends to be a lot of implementation data that people are then trying to like back engineer into something that addresses a research question, and they don't quite get there. So I think that's, again, this with the research question and then making sure that you have the data to answer it and making sure everything fits together, that you're citing the literature that supports that. Every piece has to be connected. And that's something that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. If I see that those pieces aren't aligning, like Dr. Park, that's, there's a point where I'm just going to stop reading it and be like, I don't know what's going on here. So that consistency is, for me, is important.
I would say I call it that matching, that consistency throughout that Stephanie mentioned. It if you don't have research questions, or if you tell me that you are using a critical perspective, but then everything else is just done traditionally, in the sense of you're citing folks that don't have a critical perspective. Or you telling me you're doing a counter story and then you don't even highlight any resources or scholars that write about counter story. So making sure that you are intentional throughout your work, that it's cohesive, that your questions, your theory, your literature, they all match, they all support your findings, they all support your discussion, your implications. And that your abstract is reflective of what you actually did.
Thank you.
So all of you mentioned or talked about collaborators. So I'm wondering if you would share, if you're willing, maybe how, like one of your collaborative partnerships, how you got to know that person, how that collaboration developed, and then any advice you have for how to kind of identify potential collaborators. And did that happen for you in graduate school or after? And then advice for us now, kind of in this stage, for kind of starting down that road.
Well, one of the people that I write with most, Ben Piper, someone that I met when I was in grad school. He was a few years ahead of me and was my teaching fellow for many of the courses I took. And then when I graduated and got the position at FSU, he was at RTI International, and he's now director of Africa Education. And He had a real interest in publishing, but he didn't have the time. But he had access to huge amounts of amazing data. So we were talking at a conference and he said, why don't we work together? And essentially he gave me all of his fabulous data and we co-authored papers together. So, he would kind of do the initial analyses, I would write it up and do the literature review, and then we'd hand it back and forth a few times. So that was the inspiration for that bullet I had about having common goals. So we brought different things to the relationship, but we were both really committed to publishing and getting the work out there. So I think that kind of thing can be useful. So if you find, an NGO or an educational project that really is interested in learning and evaluation and getting their project to be better known, but they don't have the skills in-house to do it or the time, those kind of practitioner relationships can be a great way to get access to data and to develop collaborations.
One of my my most meaningful collaborators is with one of my colleagues, Tara Osborne-Lampkin. And this collaboration came later in life. So we didn't know each other in graduate school. I was an assistant professor and she was a postdoc on a project. And we started collaborating because we had similar interests, but we approached our work from very different angles. And my stuff we were both qualitative researchers, and I had more of the culture, I had more of the sort of critical social justice, diversity, equity lens. She had a policy lens. We would write, and I would write the lit review, and she would write the discussion and the implications, or mainly the implications, because I hated writing that section, even though I did the lit review. It was weird. So she loved writing that part though, and writing the policy recommendations. And so we were able to work very well together and complement each other in getting, assigning of those different sections of articles. She, because of our interest in qualitative research, but we also had done very different projects. She was very good at and had lots of experience doing large scale qualitative projects. And I had been used to doing smaller projects. And so she became my sort of teacher, especially when we first started the DevEd project. And this was something new at a scale that I hadn't worked at before. So she was one of the folks that I started to work with. I think we started slowly because at first she didn't want to be my friend. She didn't want to be my friend at all. We joke about this. And she was kind of like, I don't know. And I was like, you sure you don't want to, let's go have lunch. And then she finally gave in and went to lunch with me. And she's one of my closest friends and collaborators as a result of that. So we've been able to have an open, honest conversations about if we're running late or if we have life that comes up. So being able to have those kinds of relationships with your collaborators, I think is important. But you can also not have a very close personal relationship and still have a very fruitful and meaningful collaboration.
I think in my world, I think the complementary method works really well. My closest collaborator, though, I wouldn't say we're complementary. We're the same damn person in many ways, right? So Dr. Moak and I work very closely together. And I think what makes us jive is we have a similar work style, we have a similar work rhythm. While we both went to the same graduate school and are similarly trained, we actually didn't really know each other because I started the year after she graduated. So that relationship came about, like we knew who each other were. So we would see each other at conferences or whatnot and say, hi, oh, hi, how are you? How are you? And then she was collaborating with us on our Florida project, which I didn't even know this whole story, Tamara, maybe you did, is they submitted, the same year that we submitted our first attempt at the IS grant where we didn't get funded, so did she. So see, I just learned this the other day. So CNA submitted a grant as well. And I guess Xu Ping knew this. So we took this approach of like, well, neither one of us was successful this time. Maybe we're better together, right? So we went in together on this and we've been working together since then. And I think what makes us work well still to this day is that we're just in a similar rhythm. And like, you got to find people who work with you, right? Like she and I, but then the downside is we both have the same flaws, right? So I think we'd have to remember to check ourselves there and remember, like, keep ourselves in pace or whatnot. I thought I was productive, and then I got into the world of Christine Moker, and I'm like, no, that is productivity. I think, like, but still, our interests are very, very similar. Our training is very similar. And I think the way in which we look at research is very similar. And we both have a shared commitment towards working with state agencies. Like it's just what you want to get out of it.
I want to ask another question. How innovative can you be in your writing? I mean, I know there are some parameters of academic writing, but if you want to do something like, really different, if you want to present your work in a really different manner, and so how much risk can you take in your writing? Because I'm just thinking that, if you're not innovative, then things would just, the tide will keep flowing in the same direction always. So, if you want to do something different, and so how much risk can you take, or should we just keep going with the flow?
It depends on the outlet. Some journals, some books, or, publishers are willing to take those creative, more innovative projects, and others, like I would say even some of the top tier journals are pretty rigid and fairly structured in some of the ways that they operate. And occasionally you might see somebody that kind of pushes the boundaries and you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe there is room to do that there. So I would say it just depends on the outlet. And sometimes colleagues have different approaches. So you either identify an outlet first and then you write towards that outlet. And some folks do the opposite. We write the paper first and then we find an outlet that best suits the paper. So it just depends on your approach. Sometimes you have an idea of an outlet that you want to target. And so then you can do what you need to do to craft your paper for that particular outlet. So for me, it just depends on the outlet.
This is just only tangentially related to that, but do any of you do any writing for non-academic outlets?
Yeah, I think it's. I mentioned the partnership with state agencies. I write a lot for them. So I'll be blatantly honest with you, and Tamara will know this coming as no surprise. The ASH pre-conference was 2 days ago, and we essentially submitted to an academic conference a very practitioner-focused paper, right? Like a very technical sort of report. And the feedback we got was, oh, this is missing a lot of the elements of an academic paper. And my feedback was like, yeah, I know. But like, this is also going to like the Texas state legislature, right? So, and if we're all being honest, it was because I only have so much time in the other day, right? So we sent a perfectly solid, fantastic analysis, but it was more of a technical paper. And, the style is different, right? You don't spend as much time developing a rich conceptual framework. You address that, but I think it's more of the direct, and I tend to just write this way in general, a little bit more kind of direct and to the point. And, it's a little bit different, but I've really enjoyed that sort of structure. And what I end up doing is I usually end up writing the white paper, the technical piece that goes to the state agency first, because that allows you to get information out there. Then you take a step back. And the one thing Christine and I have learned is you still gotta, on the front end, be mindful of what you're gonna do at the end, right? So, we're doing some site visits to Texas community colleges now, and we had the forethought to like sit back and think, okay, but what framework we're going to use to develop the protocols that, while in our first report we don't have to go into depth with that necessarily, but for this to become an academic paper we need to.
Yeah, I've done some more blog posts and op-ed type stuff over the last year or two, which is hard. I wrote something about pre-service teacher education, and the people who posted it took out all my references, and I almost lost my mind because the idea of like, people are going to think I stole this idea, and I had cited it with 4 references, and they're like, no one wants those, take them out. So it definitely is a transition, but I'm trying to be flexible and do more of that kind of outreach writing as well.
That's interesting. Yeah, I often read, things on like the Global Education Monitoring Report blog or things like that. And I recognize the names as people that I've seen writing scholarly work. And then I wonder, oh, how did they, how does that happen? And just about the differences there. So it does seem like an important avenue as well for reaching a wider audience. But definitely a harder and a very different kind of a approach is needed probably. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us. I know that there are a lot of people who are really interested in this, but couldn't be here live for the timing. So I'm sure they'll really appreciate the recording. And then Carrie, who wasn't able to be here today, but is on our kind of board as well, has offered to kind of put together a little infographic summarizing some of the kind of key points that you guys brought up that we can share with others too, who might not have time to watch the whole recording, but are interested to know what was discussed. So we will be sharing that, and then the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel later on. But we really appreciate your time. Really appreciate everything you've shared with us. And I'm sure we'll be continuing these conversations in other venues, but just very thankful for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.